14, John chapter 10. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them in also, and they will listen to my voice, so that there will be one flock and one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. The charge I have received from my Father. There was again division amongst the Jews because of these words. Many of them said, "He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him?" Others said, "These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe, because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me?" The Jews answered, "It is not for any good work that we are going to stone you, but for the blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God." Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and Scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because I said I'm the Son of God? If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand the Father is in me, and I am in the Father." Again they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. He went away again across the Jordan to a place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained. Many came to him, and they said, "John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true," and many believed in him there. All right, from last week, some review here. From chapter 7, verse 2, all the way through chapter 10 and verse 22. All those events in those chapters happened in the Feast of what? Feast of Tabernacles, okay? So that feast took place on our calendar in late September, early October. And when you get to John chapter 10, verse 23, these things are happening at another feast. So you have the Feast of Tabernacles in chapter 7, verse 2, all the way through chapter 10, verse 21. And then you have another feast that takes place, which is the Feast of Dedication. And that happened in late December on our calendar during the winter months, as the text says. So you have 2 or 3 months of a difference between two verses in John chapter 10, verse 21 and John chapter 10, verse 22. So the way that John writes this and sets this section up in chapter 10, verse 22, is that all of the things that Jesus said to the Pharisees in the previous verses and chapters about him being the good shepherd and they're not good shepherds, all things that happen when it comes to the blind man being hauled before the Pharisee council, all the things where Jesus talked to them in John chapter 8 about them being of their father, the devil, and they are the children of the devil, back in chapter 8, verse 44. All of these things that Jesus said in those texts and in that context, all these sayings that Jesus said straight to them, to make them upset, basically, had a few months to stew in the hearts of these Jews. More specifically, they had a long time to stew in the higher-ups of the religious authorities over those 2.5 to 3 months. And during these months between the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Dedication, John tells us and describes for us the division that existed in the minds of the Jews in chapter 10, verse 19 through 21. Okay? There was division because of what Jesus spoke about himself and what Jesus spoke about the Pharisees. There are all these conversations that happen in between this 2.5 and 3 month period, all these conclusions that are being drawn, all these discussions that are happening because of Jesus' words. And there were divisions that were happening within the Jews because of the words that Jesus spoke about himself and what Jesus spoke about the Pharisees. Now that tells me something about the words of Jesus when they are spoken. The words and the truth of Jesus will cause division. And when you meet the truth face to face and you hear the mouth of Jesus speak and the words of Jesus being spoken, there is a choice to be made. And that choice makes a division between those who are hearing it. Because you have two choices when it comes to what Jesus says about himself and what Jesus says about people. You have two choices when it comes to what he says. What are those two choices? When he tells you the truth, you can either do one of two things. You can believe it, or you cannot believe it. And that's the divisions being talked about in this text. There are those who believe, and there are those who don't believe. And what Jesus is going to zero in on in the next paragraph, after this 2.5 and 3 month period, after the Feast of Tabernacles, is that not only did he speak the truth, and that was a division in the minds of the people, but also it was the evidence that was backing up what he was saying. Because he wasn't just speaking the truth, what else was he doing to accompany these truths? Miracles and signs and wonders that no one could deny. Even the Pharisees could not deny that this man was born blind, because who did they bring before them? Do what? The blind man, but also they brought his parents, and they said he was born blind. So all of these things that were brought before the Pharisees, when it came to the man being born blind, they could not deny it. It was established fact that Jesus performed a miracle, a supernatural wonder, that this man was born blind and Jesus healed him. So Jesus says, okay, I've told you the truth, and this is what he's going to come back to at the end of this text, or the end of our lesson anyway. I've told you the truth, and not only have I told you the truth, but I have shown you the evidence and the power behind my words. So you have two things that Jesus is discussing when it comes to this. You have what he says, and then you have the reaction, which is what we've been talking about in all these classes, encountering Jesus. You have what he says and what he speaks about himself, and what he says and what he speaks about everyone else, and then you have the reaction, which is either belief or unbelief. Now, yes, there are discussions, but there are two different things that Jesus is honing in on here. When he speaks about who he is, come from the Father, I'm the bread of heaven. When he speaks about who he is, there is belief, and then there is unbelief. And these words that Jesus has been speaking about himself has been causing all kinds of division amongst the Jews, because there are those who believe and there are those who don't. There are those who are of the flock and there are those who are not. Jesus has told the Jews, Jesus has told the people of Jerusalem exactly who he is over the last few chapters. Back in John chapter 8, he says, I am the bread that has been sent from heaven. Now, if you say, I'm the bread that is sent from heaven, where did you come from? Not a trick question. You came from heaven, all right? I'm the bread that has been sent from heaven. So he says, I am from heaven. He says, I am the only light of the world. There are no other lights. There are no other lights that will ever guide you. There are no other lights that will ever give you illumination. I am the light. I am the truth. That he's been sent from the Father. He is the only good shepherd. That he has the power not only to take, or not only to give his life, but to take it up again. And he's spoken all these things to him, or to these people. That he has power that only can be connected to God. It is the truth that he is presenting to them in word and in deed. It is the only truth that brings life, and Jesus does not force anyone to believe that what he says is the truth. Jesus gave evidence, not only in word, but also in action and in deed. He manifested the power that of God within him, but the conclusion had to be made by those who were hearing the words of God and those who were seeing the miracles performed by the power of God. So when these people encounter Jesus, they hear what Jesus says about himself, who he is, and what he has come to do, and he talks about the Pharisees, and he talks about the hierarchy of the Jews. And there is division amongst the Jews because of these words. And many would come to the conclusion, that's where I want you to zoom in. There were many who came to the conclusion after hearing the words of Jesus and even knowing the miracles of Jesus that he was insane and had a demon. I want you to see that when it comes to this crowd. There were many who came to the conclusion after Jesus spoke the things about himself and after Jesus spoke the things about the Pharisees that he was insane and was oppressed by a demon. And they even asked the question, why would we want to listen to somebody who is insane and has a demon in chapter 10, verse 20? That was their conclusion about Jesus. This is crazy. Now, does that sound familiar to any modern day conversations you may have had? When you bring up Jesus, and you bring up that he's the Son of God, that he came to the world, that he was made flesh, dwelt among men, and that he died on the cross as God for the sins of the world. And what do some people say? You're crazy. That is absolutely crazy. Because when Jesus speaks the truth about himself, and Jesus speaks the truth about us, that causes a division between those who will believe and those who will not. Every single time that happens. We sing it in songs all the time. What will you do with Jesus? What will your answer be? We sing it all the time. Whenever there's a truth of Jesus placed in front of you, there are two lanes. You can believe what he says, or you won't. And that's the division that's been caused when it comes to what Jesus says about himself and the power that he is exposing when it comes to the power of God. So the words of Jesus, the proclamations of Jesus about himself, they cause this great divide between those who believe and those who will not, between those who will be a part of his flock and those who will not. Not everyone who hears the truth about Jesus is going to agree with that truth. And I want you to understand that, especially in your own life and your own conversations. Not everyone who hears the truth about Jesus is going to believe that truth. Even if it was spoken by Jesus himself. Because who's doing the speaking in this text? Jesus is. Even when that truth is spoken by Jesus himself, there are still those who will not believe what Jesus says. Now, here's a question that I want you to really think about, and it's a very easy question. Are you Jesus? And the answer is no. So, when you speak the truth about Jesus, if Jesus was reacted to in that way, where there was a division between what Jesus spoke about himself, what is going to happen to us at some point in time?
You're going to have to make a decision.
Well, you're going to have to make a decision, but if you're speaking about Jesus to somebody else, they have the exact same division. They're either going to believe what Jesus says, or they are not. So, the question we got to last week, all right, was a very good question. And we set up the stage last week when it came to this, the landscape of the temple, and Jesus walking on Solomon's porch on the east side of the temple, this amazing construction overlooking the deep valley below, the valley of Kidron. And Josephus, the historian, describing these massive blocks and the columns that were on Solomon's colonnade as Jesus was walking back and forth in this very public and very spotlight type of a scene. And the Jews are gathering around him. Now remember, this has been 2 or 3 months, all right? 2 or 3 months between chapter 10, verse 21, chapter 10, verse 22. And the people have obviously been discussing Jesus, because if you see Jesus as he is on Solomon's porch and a crowd gathers around you, obviously you know who Jesus is, and obviously he's been a topic of discussion. Now, not only that, the crowd that Jesus spoke to, specifically the higher-ups, what are they always scheming? We go back to John chapter 5, and they're always scheming when it comes to the Pharisees and the council. What are they always scheming when Jesus shows up? They're wanting to kill him. They're wanting to destroy him. They're wanting to do something to get him out of the way, to cause him to look bad from everyone else, or to have him say something that would give them the evidence that they would need to call him a blasphemer and kill him. So the Jews gather around at Solomon's porch, and it was winter. It was the Feast of Dedication, the Festival of Lights, like we talked about last time, known as Hanukkah. And the Jews asked Jesus a question. Now you have to remember the division of this crowd, because John goes back and looks at this, and the division of this crowd in chapter 10 and verse 20, many of them, when they heard Jesus speak and even saw the miracles Jesus did, they attributed that to Jesus being insane and possessed by a demon. That defines the crowd that you see that is approaching Jesus at Solomon's portico. To put it mildly, this is a hostile crowd towards Jesus, and you will find out very quickly it is a hostile crowd towards Jesus, because when you get to verse 31, after Jesus speaks a few phrases, remember he's walking back and forth on Solomon's porch, and then the question is asked, and he only speaks a few phrases, and what happens in verse 31? Same thing that happened in chapter 8 and verse 59. They pick up stones and they want to stone him. Now, let me ask you a question. Is that crowd hostile? Well, look at the evidence at the end and tell me if the crowd is hostile.
If somebody's going to pick up a rock and try to hurt me, I'm pretty well going to consider it hostile.
But yeah, hostile territory, okay? So I don't know if they brought the stones with them. I don't know if they were just looking around the courtyard to see if there was something they could throw. All I know is that when Jesus spoke a few phrases, after he spoke those few phrases, they were looking to stone him. And what is very interesting in that phrase is that John says they were looking to stone him again. Now, what does that tell you about the crowd that Jesus is speaking in front of in John chapter 10 at the Feast of Dedication? It was the same crowd that was in John chapter 8 at the Feast of Tabernacles, because they wanted to pick up stones and stone him again. So, let me ask you again. Is this a hostile crowd? There's been 2.5, 3 months since the conversation Jesus had in the Feast of Tabernacles. 2.5, 3 months later, whenever Jesus speaks a few phrases on Solomon's porch, they want to stone him again. Now, don't miss that word again. If the Jews tried to stone Jesus again, what have they tried to do before? Stone him. So this is hostile territory. And they were violently divided over what they were going to do about Jesus. And the phrase that breaks the silence, okay, when Jesus is walking back and forth on Solomon's porch, the Jews are gathering, it doesn't seem like he's speaking at all, and the Jews are gathering, and the silence is broken by this question that breaks the silence of the crowd. How long will you keep us in suspense? Now, once again, I love how the Bible sets the tone for all these teachings of Jesus by describing the situation that Jesus is in. Jesus is in perfect tense, we talked about that last week, walking back and forth, and apparently not saying anything. And if you want to put this in your mind, you have Jesus walking back and forth on the Solomon's portico, and we talked about how Josephus described the gigantic stones that were behind him and the rows of columns as they stretched, back and forth across that side of the temple. And then, what was the time, the setting? It was winter, okay? So you picture all this in your mind, and you start building all these blocks in your head when it comes to details. And what was the feast that was being celebrated during that time? The feast of, you got it, the Festival of Lights. Now, what was the Festival of Lights? Well, it's exactly what it says it is. That everywhere you look, there would be what? There would be lights. There were candles that were lit everywhere, okay? So, now you have all of this stuff in your mind when it comes to all of these pictures. The crowd's been divided over the last few months, some angrily, and they've been stewing over what Jesus says. The same crowd that was in John chapter 8, the last verse of John chapter 8, is now back again in John chapter 10. And they are looking to stone Jesus again. Now, we don't know if Jesus stayed in Jerusalem during these 2.5 months to 3 months or not. The Bible doesn't tell us where he went or if he stayed in Jerusalem or went somewhere else. But boom, Jesus shows up in the temple. All right, this is how John describes it for us. And walking back and forth in front of these massive stones, the Jews gather together. Jesus still walks back and forth. And there's this voice that comes out of the crowd. How long will you keep us in suspense? Now that phrase, keep us in suspense, I probably dove in a little too deep today, but it was really fun to do. It is literally translated, the soul of us you are taking. And in some old commentaries, very old commentaries, there was this phrase that was used to describe this particular translation. And it was an awesome picture of something that we know nothing about. I want to ask you this question because if any of you know what this phrase means, I'm not saying you're old, but you have some very old roots. Okay? So just think about that before you raise your hand with glee. Okay, this is a really old saying. All right? Did any of you ever heard hanging about tenterhooks? Okay, if you have, you are from the 16th century. Now, does anybody know what that means, hanging about tenterhooks? It's an old expression, on tenterhooks. Now, whenever I was reading some of these older commentaries, they would have this word in the tenterhooks or on tenterhooks. I'm like, what in the world does this mean? And why they use this phrase to describe what this question is all about, that why do you keep us in suspense, is that the tenterhooks were this contraption, I guess you would say, made of wood with these hooks on 4 or 6 ends, and they would stretch out these wool garments when they got done with them and after they washed them so that they would keep their shape. And they had these flexible little wood things where it would stretch out to the form they wanted it to keep. That's called a tenterhook. Anybody ever know what a tenterhook is? If you say this, you're saying you're old. No? Sheila is saying she knows.
The only reason I know, they used to do blue jeans with something that was like that. You remember Linda?
Oh, Linda, she's like, well, don't drag me into this. You may be old, but I am not.
They were stretchers. Yeah. Stretch them out as far as they'll go.
Are you serious? They did not call them tenterhooks, I don't think, did
No,
they?
but we didn't use it like that was. That's why they was.
Oh, and see, now there's other people talking. See what you did, Sheila? You brought other people into the whole conversation.
I'm old.
But you see what I'm talking about? If you were to ask a young person, I'm not a young person, you were to ask, Lily, do you know what a tenterhook is? No, Lily was like, no, I don't know. Is it some kind of medieval torture? No? So tenterhooks. It is the way that they would describe something that was suspended in anxiety or pressure. Now that's why they used that word to describe the question that was being asked. How long are you going to keep us in suspense? And what they pictured in their minds in the 15th, 16th century was these tenterhooks that were keeping this suspended and tightly in anxiety or uncertainty. What's going to happen? How long are you going to keep us in suspense? So I had to look that up and be like, what in the world's tenterhooks? So I don't know who it was in the crowd, right? The crowd was gathered. Jesus wasn't saying anything. There was this tension. And this guy, whoever he is, says, how long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. We're on tenterhooks. Now, once again, you have to remember how this crowd has been described so far by the text of John. Those who have gathered around Jesus. Now, I wanted to go into that word as well because it doesn't mean what you think it means. Those that have gathered around Jesus. The word is encircled. Now, gather is a little bit more neutral. When you start to encircle something, what does that mean? If you didn't know, it gets a little dark. I want you to picture it like a pack of coyotes or wolves around a wounded animal. That's what this word is. They were encircling Jesus. Now, once again, what is the crowd like so far that you know? Are they friendly? Hostile. They're hostile. And now John uses the word encircle. Also, they think that Jesus is crazy and has a demon. And there were those in the crowd who had already tried to stone Jesus in previous meetings. I want to set all this up because this is not a friendly scene. And it was not set up as a friendly scene. So this crowd looks like they already have stones in their pockets. They're looking for Jesus to say something where they can take those stones out and throw them at him. And they approach Jesus, they encircle him, or at least they'll have stones accessible somewhere, and they're looking around. So this question is not asked out of sincerity. It is not asked out of genuineness. It is not asked out of seeking. It was a question that was asked so that they would have the opportunity when the answer came to take the stones out of their pockets and throw them. Many of the crowd did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They wanted to get rid of him. And we think, how in the world can we miss that? How in the world can they, in that first century, when Jesus was performing all these miracles, how in the world could they miss that? With all the supernatural power, the teaching that could not be refuted or bulldozed away. And this text adds this amazing dimension to the scene. Because, once again, when was this happening? During the Feast of? The Festival of Lights, it was the Feast of Dedication. Now, for those of you here last week, here's your quiz. What is that feast about?
Pig on altar.
Do what? Big on an altar. That's what you're. That's good. That feast is about celebrating 160 years before the Maccabean revolt, where the Syrians came to take over Jerusalem and Judea, and they took over the temple, and they took over the Judean hillside, and then, like I said last week, they went to the wrong family. And they demanded that that family and that priestly family slaughter a pig on the altar. And the Maccabeans not only killed the priest that was about to slaughter the pig because that guy was a coward, they also killed the messenger of the Syrians and started a revolt against the Syrians that led all the way back to the temple and drove the Syrians out of the countryside, and they reclaimed the temple and cleansed it, and they rededicated that temple with the Festival of Dedication. Now here's where it gets fun. To the Jews, what were the Maccabees? Starts with an M. What were the Maccabees? They were Messiah-like people. What did they do? They took their strength and their might, and they drove away the physical enemy that was in front of them, and they pushed them all the way back across their borders. They retook the temple, and they purged all of the evil from the countryside, right? What did they think that Jesus was going to do if he was the Messiah? They thought he was supposed to do the same thing. Jesus looked nothing like their military Messiah. He looked nothing like the Messiah they had pictured. They were going through the Feast of Dedication to remember the people that delivered them from the hands of the Syrians with a military fight. Jesus looked nothing like that. That Maccabee guy, absolutely, they thought that was what they needed. That guy is the picture to them of a Messiah. To free the Romans from the grasp they had over them, that would have been their definition of the Messiah, because they were their oppressors, they were their overlords. Jesus didn't fit that mold. Jesus doesn't use his power to do any of that. Jesus is going around healing people. Well, that's great. What about the Romans? He's going around and he's performing miracles. Well, that's great. What about when the Roman emperor sends legions? Can you just destroy them? Jesus was not a military Messiah. And he wasn't just a Messiah for the Jews. He was a Messiah that was going to save the world from sin. The Jewish thought most of the time was about what was going to happen in physical Jerusalem with the physical throne of David and the literal throne that Jesus was going to sit upon when he came, or that the Messiah was going to sit upon when he came. That was not the case. So Jesus answers their direct question by exposing something about the one that is doing the asking. If you did not know, Jesus didn't say yes or no with his question. Can you imagine why? Oh, after all the things we've been over, when you hear the question, when there is a very hostile crowd with probably rocks in their pockets, looking for a way to kill you, and someone in the crowd says, will you tell us plainly whether or not you are the Messiah? If Jesus says yes in that situation, what happens?
We're going to throw rocks.
Yeah. Jesus turns it back on the one asking the question. I have told you. I have shown you. Just going back over a few of the phrases that he has told this crowd and other crowds back in John chapter 5 and verse 19. He has told people he is the Son of God. I mean, that's a pretty blatant statement, wouldn't you think? I'm the Son of God. He has told the people, I am the one that the Old Testament prophets have spoken of. John chapter 5 verse 39. When you see me, Jesus says, you see the Father. John chapter 7, verse 28. Jesus said, I always please the Father and I never sin. John chapter 8, verse 49. Jesus says, I've been sent from God. John chapter 8, verse 42. Jesus, if you remember, said, I am the great I am, because before Abraham was, I am. John chapter 8, verse 58. Jesus said, I am the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel the prophet. John chapter 9, verse 37. He said, I'm the bread of life. He said, I'm the light of the world. I'm the only door. I'm the only good shepherd. I have the power to raise the dead, which is very interesting because what's going to happen in the very next chapter? They don't believe that he can raise the dead. And then in John chapter 11, who does he raise? Lazarus. I have told you, I have shown you. So Jesus says to the crowd, I told you. I showed you the works that I do in my Father's name, and those are witness. But you do not believe. They did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, even when Jesus plainly said who he was and what he was sent to do, and Jesus plainly showed them the power that was backing everything. Now, you have any questions? Because I have a little bit more to go.
Well,
But,
I'll back up just a bit.
yeah.
Okay, we'll go through all that. And he made the blind man, cured the blind man.
Yeah.
But how do they explain that he was able to do that?
They can't.
Has nobody ever tried, have they ever tried to? No.
Tried to-
Sure got it, right?
Tried to cure a blind man who was born blind?
Yeah,
No, I mean, that's something that doesn't happen.
that's what I'm saying. Was that there, not there for them to see?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was, but they weren't making anything out of it.
No, because they did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was. Now, even if, I'll give you an example. If you do not believe something, and you will not believe something, no matter what is put in front of you, what are you still not going to do? If you are, I'm not gonna. And even though something's put right in front of you, what's going to happen? And I'll give you the example of it here in a second. If you say, I am not gonna, what are you not gonna? You're not gonna. Now here's the example. You remember the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? What did the rich man ask Abraham to do? He had 5 brothers who were back, still living. And what did he ask Abraham to do?
Go back to John first.
Send somebody back from the dead and tell them so they won't come to this place. Remember what the explanation was? They have Moses and the prophets. What makes you think that if someone raised from the dead and told them, they would believe them? If you have made the decision not to believe in Jesus, you will not.
Even though Jesus was telling them who he was, everything like that, the blind man, he kind of confirmed who he was and stuff like that, and they kicked him out of the synagogue.
Yeah. But, and here, before we get to the cutoff here, as I was studying this text, I became very disappointed in the commentaries and the stuff that I was reading. I'm not saying that any of them are bad. I'm just saying I was disappointed. Because I was reading all these different backgrounds of textual analysis. I'm not talking about doctrinal stuff. I'm just talking about text and ripping out the text. And these guys who were talking about the text, all of a sudden when they get to this verse of Scripture, in this section of Scripture, I mean, there were these guys that were Baptists, there were Reformists, there were Calvinists, there were anti-Calvinists, there were old preachers who've been dead for centuries, and it was like they came to this text looking to explain a thought or a doctrine or a teaching, not looking to explain the simplicity of what Jesus is saying. They had brought all this luggage with them, and when they got to this text, they were like, I want to explain to you what Jesus is saying. And it was like the very singular voice and the message of Jesus when he just said, I have told you and I have shown you, and you do not believe because you are not of my flock. That is a very simple phrase. Do you not think? You do not believe because you are not of my flock. And as soon as I get to this verse, it's like everyone who is writing about this verse takes an exit or a different lane and starts to push the accelerator doing 150. They take the exit to divine predestination or election or eternal security or how no one can lose their salvation on that side. And some put their signal on and they take the exit about free will and it's moral decision and it's our choice and it's man's decision to believe. And they cut through 4 lanes of traffic and they're yelling, anti-Calvinism. And these guys over here are like, it's about Calvinism. There is nothing in this text that Jesus is explaining in the most difficult terms possible. It is very simple. And they're trying to explain all these different conclusions, and Jesus is not introducing nor explaining any of them in this text. He is saying, if you do not believe me, you are not a part of my flock. It was amazing to me, all the comments on this text, and that just hit their particular belief when it came to their particular background. Until I read this one guy, and in my head, it was like me going through Nashville traffic. And have you ever been through Nashville traffic and going the speed limit? What happens when you go through national traffic and go to the speed limit? And people are flying by you and they're like, And you're sitting there going, and there was this one guy with all these other commentators going crazy and going towards this and that. There's this one guy, and I love him to death because it's Robertson's Word Studies, and he's a really awesome dude. And all these other people are just zooming around and going this direction and that. And he comes back and he says, the whole point has been the Good Shepherd analogy. The people in this crowd were children of the devil in spirit and in conduct, as he said in verse 43 of chapter 8. And as holy and as righteous as they proclaimed to be, they were wolves in sheep's clothing. End quote. You can't be a wolf and be a part of the sheep. You can't. You can't follow Jesus and bring stones to stone him. And you can't be something that you do not want to be. You do not believe, Jesus says, because you are not a part of my flock. End quote. There's no lines that are crazy when it comes. You do not believe because you are not of my flock. And then he goes on to explain, my sheep hear my voice. What has he just said to this crowd? I have told you, I have shown you, and you do not believe. Because of that, they are not in the flock of God. End of story. Now, people want to try to explain that and go through all the lanes to try to get there, but they miss the entirety of the simplistic point. Without believing in Jesus and his words, you will not be a part of his flock. Now, I can talk about how that happens all I want to, but it's not me that does that. That's God. That's the Spirit that does that. But if you do not believe in Jesus, you're not a part of his flock. So we'll talk about that more next week as we dive into a lot of the lanes that everybody was going in, but I guess that'll do for the soapbox for now.